This is kind of a funny thing to talk about at Royal Roads. You know, we don't have a theology school per se, and I'm no theologian. But sometimes, you know, the funny thing about research is that it takes you places, and you know, you read stuff and you think about stuff, and all of a sudden there you are in an area that maybe you always knew you were supposed to get into, but never knew you'd actually be there. So that's what I'd like to speak about. Now, one could ask the question, why this topic, especially for someone who teaches in environmental education and communication? Well, you know, there's some reasonable reasons. One is that as a group, the gang I hang out with tend to talk to other people like themselves. So we already tend to preach to the converted, and while I'm preaching a little bit, I think we have an important role in talking to the people who aren't converted, at least to engage those people that we might see as not seeing the world as we do, and talk to them. I think we need to talk to people and engage with people who have at least the potential for making strong commitments. And religious people make commitments. I mean, the fact that they go to church or synagogue or mosque is an indication of their ability to make a commitment, and we're looking at commitment from an environmental perspective. But these are good people for us. And religion is important to people. It's important to Canadians. And I think we need to find a way, a language for the environmental science gang, environmental education gang, to talk to those folks in language that's important to them about things that are important to both of us. So the idea of exploring religion and environmental science to me seemed like a reasonable thing to do. Now, I met a woman a few years ago at a little conference I was attending at Yale, at a joint conference between the theology school and the divinity school, as they call it there, and the environmental school at Yale. And this woman, Susan Emmerich, was doing work on this little island, Tangier Island, which is at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The island was inhabited by people who came from Yorkshire 300 years ago. They still speak funny. Now, people in Virginia speak funny anyways, but these people didn't speak like Virginians. They spoke with this goofy combination of Yorkshire and American mid-Atlantic accent. They live very insularly on a little island in the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. They call themselves watermen, and the people have lived their lives off of the resources in the Chesapeake Bay. And they don't much care for government, and they just do what they want. They don't buy limits to crab harvest or oyster harvest, and they just dump their crap into the bay. It's been a huge mess, a huge problem in this beautiful environment. There's a group called the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that's worked for years, 20 years, to try to get the watermen to deal with their environmental impact on the Chesapeake Bay, to no effect at all. So Susan, who's a fundamentalist Christian, working with one of the great fundamentalist evangelical scholars in environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin, a guy named Cal DeWitt, Susan went to this island to do her doctoral work in an action research project with the community. The thing about this community is it's a very religious community. The church is at the center of the community. So Susan arrives, and she starts talking with people. And there she is. She starts talking especially with the women, with the wives of the fishermen. And she goes to church with them. She's there on the same religious wavelength as they are. But she has an environmental agenda as well. And the agenda is linking the people on Tangier Island with Scripture as they might be able to interpret it. And what she ended up doing, and it was not simple at all, and she had death threats and other things, but she ended up being able to convince most of the men on Tangier Island that they were not living congruently with their belief, that they were not living in a scripturally congruent fashion. And the men signed in church publicly a covenant, agreeing that they will work with government on fish, on harvesting. They're not going to throw their crap, their oil from the bilge from their boats into the water. And they had a flag made, and the boats would fly a flag. So if I saw someone who had that flag on there doing something that was wrong, I could call them on it, because they publicly committed in church. And not only did she get them to do that, but she then worked with a group of farmers up in the very north in the Chesapeake Bay, who were in fact part of the cause of the problem through bad agricultural practices. And she went into their church community and had them meet the fishermen from Tangier. And the farmers also signed a covenant about hog waste, and fertilizer. The point being that environmental conflict in faith-based communities requires a faith-based response. And since there are lots of communities of faith around, I think that I've tried to learn something about the language that I could use to engage those people. And that's sort of the justification for this. So where to start talking about environmental science and the Bible? Well, quote from Isaiah, it starts off, in Hebrew is haaretz, and haaretz could be earth, but it's also the land. And it's probably in reference not to the globe, but it's in reference to the land where the people are, which is in relationship to the city of Tyre, T-Y-R-E, that was having some difficulties with the kingdom of Judah. But here's what Isaiah, this is what he's describing. The people have done wrong. They've polluted. They've disobeyed the teachings. They've broken the laws. They've violated. They go from small things to big things, like violating. And a curse consuming the land. So we have language that already, when you read this, is not all that far away from what some environmentalists would describe the present. We have polluted the land. We've disobeyed, broken the laws of nature. And we violated a covenant, a violation, such a powerful language. And in fact, language like this, I'll come to later, is driving in some ways some on the far right of the religious world to say, yeah, this is the prediction, so we have to hasten this, because Isaiah is the prophet who precedes the arrival. Well, Isaiah and Elijah. Isaiah is predicting the arrival of the Messiah, right? And so, if this is the way it is, this is the way it should be, because it hastens the arrival of the Messiah, the end of time. So the Bible gets used in environmental ways too. Now, who were these guys? And for the most part, they're guys. Well, they all show up, in the area around what is today present-day Israel, in that area, 1,000 or so years ago, and they all come with messages. And what I want to argue is this: that what we think of prophets and we think of prediction of the future, but if you look at what the prophets were actually doing, that prediction of the future. Back even in the 1489, Shem Tov ibn Shem Tov. So this is a Spanish Jew. Shem is part of one of the Hashem is another word for God. Tov is good, so it's a sort of good word from God. Even that period of time ago, understood that the prophets weren't about telling the future. It wasn't important that they talk about the future. They weren't concerned really with the distant future. What the prophets did was they described their present. That's the critical aspect. And they provided as accurate. Hi, Mary. No, they tried to predict as accurately as possible what the situation that they were in looked like to them. So you get Jeremiah, who has lots of stuff about saying, here's what God's saying, he said. God's telling me that right now, you folks, Israelites, you've committed 2 sins. You've abandoned God. That's what Jeremiah is saying. That's the way it is now. And they're living in broken cisterns. That is, they're living in emptiness. All through the biblical writings, the prophetic writings, it's the sense of telling the Israelites what's going on right now. And then saying, well, there are choices that you make. From Deuteronomy, God says, I'll put my words in his mouth, that is in Moses' mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command. In a biblical sense, God speaks to the prophets and through the prophets. And if we're connecting that to the science, data, nature speaks to scientists. Nature speaks to them, and nature can speak through them as well. Prophets always present choices. The prophets, all of them, will say, here's the reality, here's where we are. And we have a choice, because this is where we're going. And what's going to happen out there is not going to be nice. You're going to go into exile. You're going to lose your land. Land is a big part of it. You're going to, it's going to be miserable, and that's where you're going, based on where you are and what's happening now. But prophets always provide alternatives. They always say, there is a better place. You could, oh, Israel, sinful Israel, you could change your ways. And so, to me, one of the major demarcators is that prophets say, here we are, here's where we're going, and you have a choice. You don't have to go that way. It's more of an if-then thing. If you continue, that's where you're going, but it's not necessary. The chief rabbi of the UK, Jonathan Sacks, has a nice way of saying it, kind of separating these two ideas. Prophets don't foretell, he says, they warn, right? They don't predict, they're not speaking to predict a future catastrophe, but how can we avoid a future catastrophe? That's the catastrophe, but there are ways we could avoid it. And I love this idea, if a prediction comes true, if a scientist predicts an outcome in their result, in their experiments, it's succeeded. But if a prophecy comes true, it's failed, because it's supposed to tell you where you could go. There is a better way of operating. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a completely extraordinary man, the man on the, here, marching in Selma, Alabama with Martin Luther King and Ralph Bunche. Rabbi Heschel talked about, on this march, he said he felt like he was praying with his feet. This was a guy who was smuggled out of Poland as the war began. Wrote extraordinary books in English, a second language he learned in his adulthood. But he wrote, his doctoral work was done in Germany on the prophets. And he talks about this message. He talks about the prophets beginning with a message of doom and ending with a message of hope. It's not just mere prediction, it's exhortation. He discloses the future to illuminate what's going on now. This is what the prophets do. And it's different from, say, the Greek idea of an oracle or a soothsayer. You know, these were folks who looked for patterns. They were also making predictions. But the predictions the oracles made were different because there was no slack, right? What was going to happen was going to happen. You know the story of Oedipus, right? He was going to kill his father and marry his mother, and he did everything possible to avoid that destiny. But that was it. That was his fate. Judaism as such and the biblical tradition does not really deal with fate very well. It says you always have choices. It's not a necessary outcomes. So it was kind of straightforward what the prophets did. They said, here's the now. There's a possible there that's not a good place to go. And you could make things different. You could do other things different. It wasn't the prophetic, the predictions of the oracles. And the prophets, too, don't just speak to one person, they speak to the people. The prophets are not, they're talking about collective actions. In fact, Heschel writes around the prophets, he says, his tone rarely sweet or caressing is frequently consoling and disburdening. His words are also often slashing, even horrid. And if you read some of the prophetic writings, horrid is not a far word. Heschel says, designed to shock rather than edify. And then he says, often, again referring to the prophets, his words begin to burn where conscience ends. Kind of a fabulous thought, Prophets didn't lead comfortable lives. Poor old Jeremiah, no kids, no wife, couldn't hang out with his people. He had one job, and his job was to warn the Jews in the northern kingdom in Judah that unless they changed their ways, they were in deep trouble. He was threatened with death. I mean, it was a miserable, miserable kind of life. And not only that, he knew he wasn't going to be listened to. He knew the mission was doomed. And Heschel writes again, a man whose message is doomed for the people he loves not only forfeits his own capacity for joy, but also provokes the hostility. The sights of woe, the anticipation of disaster nearly crush his soul. Now, I put these people up here because I think about them. You all know David Suzuki, of course. Jim Hanson's at NASA, one of America's greatest climate scientists. Steve Schneider, probably number 2 greatest scientist, climate scientist, is at Stanford, same place that Paul Ehrlich, who's been writing about environmental issues for 40 years. And then I put here, just out of respect for a friend and colleague, Andrew Weaver, who's probably Canada's big name in climate change work up at UVic. And I worry about these guys in the sense of the sights of woe, the anticipation of disaster nearly crushing their souls, because this isn't easy stuff to talk about. And they carry the burden of a prophet. It's not just data to them. It's much more, and their souls are burdened by what they carry. I mean, what do you do when you have something like this? When you write a paper that says, this paper shows that climate change that takes place due to increases in carbon dioxide, it's going to be irreversible for 1,000 years. Jim Hanson, 2 years ago, wrote something in the Philosophical Transactions, Royal Society of London, saying, when we talk about forever in the climate change world, figure out forever is 500 years. Like talking 500 years ago was forever. We have the data about global carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These guys are saying, irreversible for 1,000 years. What do you do? How do you go home at night? And think about irreversibility. This is the kind of burden that prophets carry as opposed to mere scientists. A guy who does a lot of writing around, not all scientists, I'm saying, are prophets, right? They're not all prophets, but some, I think, act this way. Bron Taylor writes a lot of stuff on environment and religion. And this is a great image from a movie. Parliament here is, right, sea level rise, Thames backs up, right, flood London. But he talks about that what's happening now is a significant innovation, because the apocalyptic expectations, which traditionally came from prophets, are now coming from the environmental scientists. So this is being recognized now, that there's this strange change that our colleagues are now, in funny ways beginning to act as prophets. One of the most interesting pieces of sort of writing, prophetic writing, comes from Herman Daly, one of the great father of ecological economics, left the World Bank and now is at the University of Delaware, University of Maryland. And he wrote a book back in the 90s called Beyond Growth. Now, we didn't write it like this, but I've taken the liberty of versifying it to make it look more biblical. But here he is. Here he's writing stuff that feels biblical to me, right? We must face the failures of the growth idolatry. We must stop crying out to the growth economy, deliver me, for thou art my God. Instead, we must have the courage to ask with Isaiah, is there not a lie in my right hand? So, people are being called almost to writing in a way that is reflective of biblical writing, of prophetic writing. Sistine Chapel, Jeremiah. Heschel writes, the prophet is a lonely man. And Jeremiah, poor guy, right? 23 years. 23 years he's been getting data. Right? He's been getting raw data, and he's talked about this data to the folks, and they haven't listened. And the burden of that loneliness, I think, is felt now by my colleagues in environmental science. I think you talk to people, when you talk to them over a beer or so, they're carrying the burden of the data. The people who are out in the field doing field-based biology, looking at endangered species, or you can feel it. And it's not just a new feeling. In 1970, one of the great tweed-wearing, formal English little ecologists, who was probably the last guy to be a professor at Yale without a PhD, G. Evelyn Hutchinson, one of the fathers of modern ecology. This is what he wrote in Scientific American in 1970. Based on mounting and reasonably objective evidence, in 1970 he's writing, that the length of the life of the biosphere as an inhabitable region for organisms is to be measured in decades. Here was this beautiful old man looking at the data and saying, it's entirely the fault of our own species. You know, there's Jeremiah, 23 years I've been presenting you with the data. It's a lonely place to be. You know, I don't know, and it's an area that I'd like to explore more, and I'm trying to develop the relationships, because we don't know how many of our colleagues are being crushed in their soul by this kind of work, and that many of our best scholars, you know, spending their professional lives trying to deal with the research and present their findings and their offer of both hope and warnings about directions. And then they end up with stuff like this, right? Not only lonely, but dangerous. And maybe you've heard about this. This was just a month ago. The U.S. Senator from Oklahoma, who released 17 names and addresses of leading climate scientists in the U.S. he wants prosecuted as criminals, right? And Steve Schneider saying, they shoot abortion doctors here. 2 weeks ago, I was teaching a class for Andrew Weaver up at UVic, 2 weeks ago Tuesday, and he told me that, this was just after this came out, and he told me that the day before, on the Monday before, one of these 17 guys, in the morning, doorbell rang, he goes to the door, opens the door, there's no one there, but there's a mutilated dead animal on his door, on his doorstep, which is about as scary a warning as you could have. And that's all driven by this guy. So it's not just lonely. Prophets live potentially dangerous lives. It's a lonely place. So, okay, so that's my preface, right, about prophets and prophecy. I've argued that prophets aren't concerned about necessarily predicting the future, but they're describing the present and then saying, if you continue, this is where you're going to go, and there's a possible alternative way of going, and that we can have hope about moving towards. Well, now back in those days, no one was busy testing prophets, right? Predictions of prophets, but now we can actually, because we can study modern scientific prophecy and see whether they're on the mark or not. And what's so interesting is to be able to do that work now on this book called Limits to Growth. This came out in 1970, so the work, or 72. So the work was done probably around 1970 or so to 1972. It was a major project funded by the Club of Rome. Which, it wasn't written by the Club of Rome, but it was a report to the Club of Rome that was thinking, again, it's almost 40 years ago, beginning to think about where was the planet heading. This was just a few years after the first Earth Day. It was developed by this gang of people, Donella Meadows and Dennis Meadows. They were married then. They separated. Jürgen Randers, William Behrens. Donella Meadows died about, I don't know, 8 years ago of breast cancer. Left a tremendous legacy of fabulous writing. It was published in 30 languages. It sold over 30 million copies. A science book, right? 30 million copies. And here's what they said. They built a computer model in 1970 with a computer, it was the size of this room, right? And they wanted to look at 5 trends of concern. They wanted to model 5 trends: industrialization, population growth, malnutrition, so food availability, non-renewable resource depletion, and an overall deterioration of global environment. That's what they wanted to look at. That's what they wanted to try to model in a global sense from 1970 to 2100. So that's the time frame of this book. So they they built a model, with all of the limitations of computer models, they built a model in the early days of computers. It grew off of the systems model work of their teacher, a guy named Jay Forrester at MIT. And this is what can you even remember when, you can't. You have to be old to remember, when this is what computer printouts look like. And these are hand-drawn lines. The computer could just put out letters, these little characters, right? But this is published in their book, Figure 35, and this is more or less what they were looking. They were modeling resources, food per capita, industrial output per capita, pollution, and population. And for their kind of business as usual model, what they call the standard run model. This is what their data repeatedly came out like. I mean, you can muck around with things, but this was the best representation of what they found. They found that food production per capita peaked around 2008. Industrial output per capita peaked around 2010. Pollution peaked here, and following the peak of pollution, human population began to decline around 2050. And in fact, these models, and this is only going to 2100, okay? And no matter how they ran this, this stuff was all the same. Things peaked and crashed. You know, industrial output peaked and then just sunk, right? And then human population globally just crashed. And this was, food production, resources availability, everything just starts falling down because the model is all based on exponential growth, which what we understand as being of value in our culture. And the model keeps on crashing. So this was tough, It was a very controversial book. Within a year, a group out of the UK wrote a rebuttal to it, and they wrote things like this, again, and calling them prophets, right? Talking about, comparing them like to other great prophets of world salvation through world breakdown, Karl Marx. Their apocalyptic vision of the immediate future are tempered by their glittering image of utopia, barely discernible through the fire and brimstone that rages in the historical form. I mean, only the Brits can write like that. But they were attacked, professionally. It was quite a difficult period for these guys because they were saying, here we are, and to the best of our ability, here's where we're going. And our whole society is based on being here and thinking this is the right place to be, and going on that route is the way we want to go. And they're saying the opposite. They proposed actions, and they were beaten up for it. Paralleling Heschel's categorization of prophets providing messages of doom before hope, here they talk about, we need more study, but taking no action to solve these problems is equivalent to taking strong action. A very powerful piece of writing. Decision to do nothing is a decision to increase the risk of collapse. And then if we wait until these constraints are unmistakably apparent, it's going to be too late. The message of doom, but they finish the book, is also a cause for hope. Again, they're just walking in the prophetic footsteps. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. And that's what the prophets would say. Oh, Israel, it might not be easy to go this way, but it's possible. It's possible. And in fact, we know how to do it, right? And and we can make a new society in that sense. So again, walking very much in those prophetic footsteps in the early 70s, they spoke, the prophecy was ignored, and their persons were really at times denigrated and demeaned, and their competence was questioned. And yet that's always the price that prophets pay for doing this kind of work. So recently, and this is what really pushed me into, I try to read broadly in journals. It was a paper came out in 2008, Global Environmental Change Journal, scholarly, peer-reviewed, serious journal. And this guy looked at that model, that first one, all those goofy little things from limits to growth, and actually took independent data from 1970 to 2000 to see, well, how good was the prediction? And this is what he concluded. And I'll show you some of the stuff. He said the observed historical data, most closely matched the simulated results of the limits to growth standard run, the one I showed you, for almost all the outputs reported. And this scenario results in global collapse before the middle of the century. I was pretty stunned when I read this paper, and that put me into, that really confirmed this interest about prophets. I've not talked with this fellow, but I'd be curious to know what it felt like when he wrote that sentence. And then he writes also, unless this is invalidated, that this simple model from 40 years ago, is that the global system is on an unsustainable trajectory unless a substantial and rapid reduction in consumptive behaviors in combination with technological progress. So, wow, it's kind of serious stuff. And then he presents his data. So here are some of the models. So this is world population. The standard run is the green color here. This would be if the model had stabilized, if we got down to basically to a zero growth rate in human population. The dark dots are the observed data, and they match up exactly onto both the both of these versions of the limit to growth data. Here again on services per capita, the models are the solid dots are very, very close to these standard run results. Food per capita, here's the standard run. The food per capita actually is better than the standard run, and we'll come to that in a few minutes. Industrial output is basically right on the slope and the data points. And there are others. I didn't want to put them all up here. So the question is, well, what do we do with results like this? I mean, the first 30 years of the limits to growth model were pretty much on the mark. We got another 30, 40 years before we get to that population crash that they predict. There's lots of ways we can deal with data we don't like, just like the Israelites did in the days of the biblical prophets. We can just not believe it. That's pretty clear. We can not believe it. Or we can sink into hopelessness and helplessness and despair. And again, we see that going on around us. Or we can think, fatalistically, what's going to happen is going to happen. There's nothing I can do about it, so I'm just going to keep on going on and doing what I can do. Or that maybe someone else will fix it. That's what's going to happen. Someone else will fix it, and I won't have to worry about it. These are all ways that we can happen. Or it won't happen to me. It's going to happen to those poor people in the South, right? I don't have to worry about it here. Or that maybe it'll just all go away. Like if you're a little kid, maybe the problem will just go away. Or maybe we could say that this is in fact God's will, and we shouldn't mess around with this. Just keep going, because this is what's expected. And that is arguments that are being used out of both some of the Isaiah prophecy and the book of Revelations. So 35 years ago, sort of modern day prophets said, here's what's cooking, and here's the doom side, and here's the hope side. We've what do we do with this? Well, immediately upon the publication, after this gang from the UK tore it to shreds, the final chapter in this book says, well, after we've just torn it to shreds, what remains of Jay Forrester and Dennis and Donella Meadows' efforts? Nothing. Okay? Nothing that they could use in 1970 to make policy formulation. Nothing. So we've blown 35 years, nothing indeed. The model does say we have another few decades of economic growth, perhaps before things fall apart. But do we wait? Do we wait for another 30 years to see whether they were really right? And this is a difficult question, right? The data is indicating the model was reasonably predictive. Or do we take the message of hope from these guys? They did see there were things, if you put into the model was called World 3, that will give you a sustainable outcome. 1970, again, they're writing this, right? If you can come up with a birth rate more or less equaling death rates, if you can stabilize human population, that helps to stabilize the model. If you start using less material consumption and you take care of your renewable services, that helps the model a lot. The maintenance of agricultural land is a huge part of the model for maintaining human population. And can we become more efficient in terms of industrial output so that if you can reduce the per unit consumption of resources, that also helps the model achieve sustainability. Now that word sustainability wasn't used in 1970, but that's what we're talking about. So there is hope. There are things that'll help us to get to where we want to be. And those are the decisions we have to make. I'd like to then finish with, so getting close to the end here, with the question about, it's sort of like all about betting in a way. And one of the problems that the biblical tradition had to deal with was the question of false prophets. right? Because how do you, I love this picture, the wolf, right? How do you deal with false prophets? Because maybe these guys are all just, maybe they're all like, we think they're the lamb, and they're really the wolf. So Deuteronomy, right, referring around the time that the writer of Deuteronomy is talking about Moses, says, now, how can we know if know it is the word that Yahweh, Yod-He, Vov-He is the acronym that Jews use to describe the name of God. What if the prophet's not reporting correctly? Should the prophet speak in the name of Yahweh, but the word not happen, not to come about, then clearly, that is the word. It shouldn't be world. In other words, a false prophecy would indicate that it wasn't the word of God. And the injunction is kill false prophets. So not only are these guys lonely potentially, it's really a dangerous world for them. It's risky if you make the bad predictions. Now, the example that I'd like to bring up is another book of around that time. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich, who was a butterfly expert, population biology and butterflies at Stanford, published a book called The Population Bomb, where population control or race to oblivion. And he basically took the rapid rate of world's population increases in the 60s and predicted that hundreds of millions of the world's poor would die through starvation and disease in the 1970s and 1980s. And it didn't happen. So what do we do with this? Do we kill him? Right? He didn't have the data clearly analyzed. His assumptions about what the state of the world was like could have been flawed. Maybe he really misread the current situation, as the prophet has to do. Maybe he misread it, and then his prophecy was flawed. But in fact, what's likely happened is, and this is a problem that has been well talked about through at least Jewish commentary over the centuries, people took him seriously. And the problem is that for a false prophecy is if the people take the message and then do what the prophet says they should do, change their ways, well, then you don't end up with the outcome of the initial prophecy. So in fact, through the 60s and 70s, there was tremendous effort placed on family planning, on the Green Revolution, increasing food production, and thus we didn't have the prediction that Paul Ehrlich had. He, in a sense, prophesied that, if we keep on going the way we are, we're going to end up with real problems, or we can deal with family planning and agriculture, and globally we dealt with family planning and agriculture. So a negative prophecy, then, is not a suitable test of a false prophet, really, because there's no way to know, in a sense, that if the people collectively take the warning, heed the warning of the prophet, then of course the prophet's message is not going to, the initial grim prophecy is not going to be seen. And there's quite, Moses Maimonides, a Spanish rabbi from the 12th century, 11th century, he wrote this. He said, if a prophet predicts something bad, such as that so-and-so will die, or that his year will be one of war or famine, etc., and his prediction did not come true, it's not a disproof of his prophecy. And we don't label him as a false prophet. But he talks about if a prophet decrees good things and his prediction did not come true, then he's definitely a false prophet. Okay? For whatever, right. So from here we see that a prophet is tested only with respect to good matters. So again, this will come up in a second. Right. So a contemporary Christian writer, again, 2009, I found this very compelling too. The message is painful for the prophet to utter and the people to hear. This contemporary writer saying it's likely authentic. But if prophetic words are popularly received, we have reason to doubt them. And when you think about the conflict we're now having around climate change, about global warming, and about what's going on in the atmosphere, it's the scientists who are uttering the painful message. Right? They're the ones saying, boy, I don't know what's going on. And it's the climate deniers, which really are industry funded and far right on the religious spectrum, they're the ones who are saying, don't worry, be happy, right? And in this guy's analysis, you'd have to say they're the ones less likely to actually be speaking the truth. And because at the end of the day, if they're wrong, we've really made a colossal bet. And to finish, just to give you from the limits to growth, it's a long piece, but in 1992, they did wrote a book called Beyond the Limits. And this is part of the preface. And they talked about what it was like to do the work. When they did this, 20 years ago, they went through this whole sequence. This is prophetic sequence: grief, loneliness, reluctant responsibility. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the martyred Lutheran pastor who was killed in Nazi Germany just weeks before the end of the war, wrote in a letter from prison about this issue of responsibility. He talked about the necessity of being ready to take responsibility, and the limits to growth folks, they took it reluctantly. But then here's this hopeful. These futures, don't have to be miserable. We can turn to face the reality. The idea of limits, not barriers, not obstacles, not threats. They're guides to a new world. We're at this point now about betting on the future. We're always in a sense at forks and roads. We're betting on, just as the Israelites had to bet on what was the right thing to do back in the days of the temple and before, we now have to do the same. Policymakers, decision makers, and citizens alike are now having to judge who is the modern prophet. Which prophet should we believe in? Which prophet should we follow? Who's giving us the best description of our current reality, and then by extension, a description of our likely future? And it all seems to hinge on whether the prophecy is compelling, the prophet's believable, and the changes that we're being told we have to make are perceived to be doable. It also hinges on our imagination that must be able to ask the question, can we and our children live with the consequences of not taking these modern prophets seriously? So that's what I've been thinking about. Thanks,
Thanks so much, Rick. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. Anybody?
I'm not a biblical scholar, so I have to avoid that.
Neither am I. But we improvise.
But I have a question about false prophets.
Yeah.
One of the people writing now about globalization and ecology they came to the game pretty late in their careers. People who had worked for the WTO and the World Bank and the IMF, and now they're writing about these issues.
Yes.
Bob Blair in Alberta was the CEO of Petrocan, and he and his colleagues spent their entire life destroying northern Alberta, and then when he retired and had grandchildren, and he said, whoops, I made a mistake.
Oops, yeah.
I mean, a lot of these prophets are pretty late in the game now. I guess the question I have for you is, are they more credible because they were players in the bigger game before that, or less credible?
Okay, so it's a really interesting question. So one thing is that people tend to be more pessimistic as they get older. In general, I mean, the psychology talks about this, that as you confront your own mortality more, the world can look grimmer and grimmer. And so I worry about that phenomenon, about all these gray-haired guys saying the world's coming to an end, when literally for them the world is coming to an end, right? Because their life is coming to an end. But I think for many of these guys, I mean, Herman Daly had the gray hair in there. Now, Herman Daly was a senior economist at the World Bank, and began to see, I think some of us aren't as smart as others, and sometimes it takes a lifetime of stuff before you actually have the wisdom to understand what it means to not buy the cultural agenda. And so, thank goodness, a guy from Petrocan can maybe begin to confront, the assumptions of that world, and be public about the criticism, publicly critiquing it. I think we need these voices wherever and whenever they come. And maybe these are things initially that are just too hard to see when you're 20 years old or 30 years old, when you're too wedded into the career, stuff you can't step back and view. The prophets, that's a good question. See, I'm trying to think, how old were these guys, given that they had relatively shorter lifespans? I think most of the prophets were also they weren't hearing these voices necessarily as teenagers. But good question. I also worry about all the gray-haired guys who've spent their life doing other things. Yeah.
Isabel?
I'm curious, because you started the presentation with that very provocative piece on the island, like by Chesapeake Bay.
Tangier Island, yeah.
Tangier Island, because I was wondering if there was an agenda there for you, because what you are demonstrated there is using a faith-based approach, right? Speak their language, or
Yeah.
find the mutual language.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if that's part of what you're arguing in this in terms of carrying forward, right? The messages are there,
Mhm.
and maybe it's the language. Maybe we
Yeah.
have to communicate with certain people in a certain way. And I'm just
It
kind of
is.
curious what your thoughts around that in your agenda.
Yeah, I think it is. I do talk in religious contexts, and I'm anxious to know more about how I can find the language and the interpretations that might help people who are right now unwilling to look at the data as I would see it, and find ways of this. I mean, in a very operational way, this could be. I mean, I'm interested in this more than in an operational way, but in an operational way, this is a leverage point. And when I met Susan at Yale, I mean, it was real interesting, right? Because that's the world she lives in. Those are the churches she goes to. She's a believer and very serious. And her supervisor, Cal, is a very serious evangelical Christian. And yet they've been able to find ways to take what they see as scientists and incorporate that into the biblical construct to lead them to talk to their community about sustainability in a way that I would understand as not being someone from that world. So I'm looking at, is this the kind of thing that I can go to churches and talk about prophets? That prophetic conversations are just as, I mean, in fact, I couldn't believe how much evangelical writing I was reading and liking, because around some of these issues. I see there is as much as we might stereotype, there's a huge and serious scholarly, growing, thank goodness, scholarly discussion within the evangelical community around these issues, and I think it's really powerful, and to be, I mean, sometimes my Jewish friends would say the problem with Protestants is that they just don't have enough history behind them, right? They still think it's really simple when you have thousands of years of conversation, it's not simple. You've got all this dialogue, and now the dialogue around environment and land is beginning to emerge, and some of it's breathtaking and completely on the mark. So I want to find myself there somehow, as an educator and communicator.